There was a man on an airplane, and there was a young couple sitting in front of him. And the young couple seemed to be quite affectionate, doing a little soft petting. And the man's first reaction, he told me, was this, that first he thought, how dare they? They're not married. Who do they think they are doing this in front of everybody else? And then the man caught himself and realized, wait a minute, I don't know if they're married or not. And then the man realized that when he looked deep within himself, he was a little bit jealous because he wanted to be experiencing that kind of affection. And instead he decided that instead of condemning them, he would just look and see, okay, what they're doing is a beautiful thing in terms of exchanging affection. True, he wouldn't have the opportunity at that moment to enjoy that affection, but he began to think about the blessing of his wife. He began to think about how all he had to do was just wait. My dear brothers and sisters, in the second reading that we hear today from St. James, we hear this examination of our hearts. And it's something that should call us all to be a little attentive. Because it's very true that what happens is when we see something going on, when we see a blessing happening to somebody else, sometimes what we do is we first judge that person as unworthy of that blessing, or we become jealous. Instead of having faith that if blessing comes to one, blessing should come to all, in its proper time, in its proper way. That when we see other people being blessed, this should encourage us, because it means that if God has blessed other people, He wants to bless us as well. When we notice these things within our hearts, we shouldn't be dismayed. The Lord already knew that these kind of things were in our heart. That's why He had James write what he wrote, because He specifically wanted to expose to the light the things that were going on in the heart that were warring against the Spirit of God. Not to then condemn the person, but then that the person might realize, oh, this is what's going on with me when I let things go on their own without examining my life. We see the same thing happening with Jesus, by the way. When Jesus was having all of these people follow Him, the Pharisees were getting jealous. And in order to dismiss Him, what did they do? They judged Him as being ungodly somehow. They had to. Because they couldn't admit the fact that they really wanted other people to be following them the way that they were following Him. They really wanted that same kind of influence. They really wanted to see miracles happening. But since they didn't, instead of examining their hearts and asking of themselves, what's going on within me that needs to change, they condemned Jesus. We see Jesus also bringing up this issue of competition with the apostles in the gospel. And Jesus is basically letting everybody know that He can bless the simplest and the smallest first. And basically let everybody else try to figure out, well, why did that person get the blessing first? Because God wanted it that way. That's why. Not easy. When we look at Genesis, we see two brothers, Cain and Abel. God looks upon Abel's sacrifice and looks favorably upon it. And my Hebrew professor said it wasn't that God was not going to look upon Cain's offering and bless Cain's offering. He was just waiting. He needed to test Cain's heart. And that's why God says to Cain, look, if you do well, you have no reason to be downcast. But if you don't do well, sin is lurking, looking to conquer you. You can resist it if you want. So today we ask the Lord specifically to give us the grace to be able to examine our hearts, to be able to examine our heart motives. This is what we hear from James. He says, where do the wars and where do the conflicts among you come from? Is it not from your passions, we should say evil passions, that make war within your members? You covet, but you do not possess. You kill and envy, but you cannot obtain. You fight and wage war. You do not possess because you do not ask. You ask, but you do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. Sometimes God has to say no to our prayers because we've asked from the wrong heart motivation. Selfish ambition doesn't mean basic needs that we need, right? That's not selfish. To say, God, I need clothing, I need food, I need shelter, I need to take care of my family, that's not selfish. But selfish ambition would be, God, I want to get ahead over so-and-so. That's selfish, right? Or, God, I want everybody else to think how great I am. Isn't that selfish? Okay. But we see the difference. Asking for good things for oneself and for others is not necessarily selfish. Asking only for oneself is selfish. We get this wrong sometimes. Let me say that again. We get it wrong sometimes because we think that if we're asking anything for ourselves that we're selfish. Well, that's the enemy who wants to basically exhaust our strength, right? And tell us, you can't receive, that would be selfish. God says, love one another as I have loved you. So what's the first thing that we think is supposed to happen there? Not that we're supposed to love others, but that we're supposed to receive the love that God has for us first, right? Yes? Okay. So we see that there are some things that aren't selfish. But when we begin to address our situations in the world from our own mindset and not from what God has promised us, we can get self-centered and we can get in the wrong mindset. We can get selfish, or we can be afraid. God, you have to. I'm so afraid. And what does Jesus say many, many times in the Gospels? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. So when we come from a third heart position, from a third heart attitude of faith in the goodness of God, that yes, sometimes he says wait, but he does have good things in store for us because he's promised us that. Then we see basically God's provision. When we wait with that kind of trust, when we say, God, this is what your word says about you, that if wicked parents know how to give good things to their children, how much more will you, my heavenly Father, give good things to me when I simply ask without trying to coerce you? How many times do we try to make a deal with God? Right? Let's be honest. But that doesn't work. You can't coerce God. You can't force God to do your will. But when we get onto God's page, we see, yes, he gives good things to his children. Such good things that we celebrate even today. This very Eucharistic banquet should blow our minds because God gives himself to us. So why are we afraid that he would fail to give us the smaller things that we need? He gives himself first, right? I always liken this to, somebody giving you $1 billion and you're afraid to ask him for an extra nickel. If someone's so generous as to give you $1 billion, he'll give you the nickel too, right? Right. And so this is the kind of attitude that we come to the Lord with. Not one that has to judge other people when they're blessed as not being worthy of the blessing or some reason being condemnable, as the guy on the airplane decided to do at first. Thank God, God got his heart, right? And not out of jealousy thinking, oh, I'm going without. The second movement of that guy on the airplane, right? but instead a simple trust of, God, you have good things for me too. Thank you that this person is being blessed. Thank you that these people are being blessed. Thank you for the good thing I'm seeing out there. And thank you for the blessings that I will receive someday too.